Yeah, there's a distinction that I want to make between, it sounds like you were talking about we would take a survey of the world and figure out what people think is right and wrong, and then that would determine what we would define as morally right and wrong. That would be a kind of planetary subjectivism, where morality is grounded in terms of what most people on the planet value. What I was talking about is a very different issue, where I was talking about resolving just the semantic issue of what we decide to define as morality, how we decide to use that word tool, is that the most practical way to use a word tool is to use it in a way that meets two conditions. The first condition is that it successfully refers to things that actually exist. It's really unproductive to use words, to continually talk about things that don't exist. And then the second one is we want to generally capture what most of us are talking about when we use that word. So that's why if I come up here and give a talk on general relativity, and then I suddenly say I'm talking about morality, that's just not useful. So I'm not saying that we should take a survey of what most people think is right and wrong, and that would determine what's right and wrong. I'm saying something different. The survey part was just to resolve the semantic issue of what most people mean by moral terms. But there's still the matter of, does the theory that has an account of those assumptions of moral discourse successfully refer to things in the real world? That's probably still quite unclear, but maybe we're getting there. Who's next? I guess maybe on the aisle there?
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about evolution, and I want to believe, and I like the idea that we can discover moral facts, and I want to believe that there is some, whether it's just not one or a population of moral truths that is universal. But I realized this year, it was the first year, that I was talking to Eugenie Scott, understanding and kind of becoming conscious of what evolution in a biological context means that there's multiple answers, and it depends what environment you're in. So as time progresses and environmental circumstances change, it changes the moral landscape accordingly, and the moral landscape has to adapt accordingly. So by doing these kind of studies, I think deeper, I guess my question is, do you think that you run the risk, or is it dangerous to kind of presuppose that there is something, or just is it better to just be aware that there is a constant, and the only constant is that change?
Well, this kind of goes back to actually one of the earlier questions from the previous gentleman who I didn't answer the question then. The question of aren't we just, if we do this survey thing where we go out and find what most people mean by moral terms, aren't we just committing ourselves to this snapshot in time? Is that where some of your concern is coming from?
I just fear that scientists in the white coats, I'm a scientist myself, but we're perceived in this one way, coming to tell you what's right. I mean, there's such a pushback to that kind of moral top-down direction that I think it's dangerous to do that.
That's a very different question then. I think most people are very comfortable with top-down morality because most people are theists. But I think doing it scientifically is actually a very from-the-ground-up way to do morality, because you've got thousands of different people and you can test their claims against the world, and you could have your white coat on, but you could be wrong, and I could show you to be wrong because I could run the experiment and do the measurement. And so this would be a really collaborative effort to find moral facts, and it would be something that, like the rest of science, is totally amenable to correction by better data or new experiments. And so, to me, it would be the opposite of a top-down morality. It would be like science is, where it's endlessly correctable and accountable to the evidence, instead of accountable to untestable assertions about divine commands or untestable assertions about brute moral facts that exist in a Platonic heaven. I'm not sure if that answered your question. But...
I mean, yeah, that does answer part of it, but I guess the other part is intrinsic in this system would be a kind of agreement to accept whatever comes out of your survey, as opposed to just being aware that different moralities work at different circumstances and times.
Gotcha. Yeah, so again, the survey is not about the results of what it is that's right and wrong, it's just about the results of what we generally mean by moral terms. And so as long as we're clear that that's what we're talking about, that when I talk about morally good now, I'm talking about this particular set of definitions, and we're very clear about that, like scientists are, then I think we've resolved the problem. Because the problem usually is that we aren't clear about what we're talking about, and we're talking past each other, like Kristen and I were when we were disagreeing about great art, but we hadn't provided the definition of great art. I don't know, hopefully, we'll let somebody else ask a question, but hopefully it's somewhat helpful. Yeah?
I just had a question about when you say making morality a science, what's your opinion on like religion? If science shows a paradigm, if you go outside of social norms of conducting an experiment, then you won't be taken seriously by the scientists.
Yes, that's actually very true. There is a huge resistance in the scientific community to making any kind of what's called normative claims, especially moral claims, because science is very successful because it doesn't engage in philosophy, and it sticks to facts about what is in the world and not about more fuzzy questions about what ought to be the case. And so scientists are very understandably resistant to this idea, but I think if it's explained to them that what we're doing is really just first settling the semantic issue, getting this conflict of definitions out of the way and just picking a definition and saying this is what we're talking about, then I think scientists will be quite happy to measure and test what it is that promotes the well-being of conscious creatures or whatever we're going with. So I think we just need to make the semantic issues very clear first, and then I think scientists will recognize that this does fall under the is category, that this is a question that falls under their domain. It is a question about quarks and electrons that manifest themselves in terms of brain states or whatever we're trying to measure. Now, this actually goes back to another question that I didn't answer from a previous questioner about the is-ought gap. This comes from David Hume, and he has a passage, a very famous passage, about how in every previous vulgar system of morality, I'm always encountering an argument, a moral argument, saying that something is wrong because we've got, it's commanded by God, and then suddenly there's this gap, and we're not talking about is statements anymore, but we're talking about ought statements is, and nobody's ever explained to me or justified what this gap is. Now, most people have read Hume, or a lot of people have read Hume to be saying that you can't demonstrate the truth of an ought claim by talking about is claims. But they probably haven't read the next chapter of Hume, where Hume justifies a bunch of ought claims in terms of his claims. So the way that think about it this way. Either ought claims are part of the world of is, or they're part of the world of is not. If you're making ought claims and they're not part of the world of is, I have to say I don't care about that. The other question is, if ought claims are not part of the world of is, how would they have an influence on matter that we would care about? So I think ought claims are part of the world of is. A really simple way to say this is that one very uncontroversial type of ought is what's called a hypothetical imperative, where you say, if you want to get from Fort Collins to Denver, you ought to go south. This is a very simple type of ought claim to justify. It's just a desire and a prediction. You recognize the desire to go from Fort Collins to Denver, and you make a prediction that if you go south, you'll end up fulfilling that desire. So this is an ought that is fully explained in terms of is statements. An is statement about a desire that exists in someone's brain, and an is statement about the geographic locations of Denver and Fort Collins. So I think it's going to turn out to be the case that all the oughts that we can justify have to come from the world of is, or else they have no impact on the world of matter that we live in, and they're just part of the world that is not, and then I don't care about them.
So you started off your speech by talking about how, as an atheist, you're asked the question, how can you have morality without God? And obviously that's a big issue for a lot of people, and a lot of people have to appeal to God or some sort of deity in order morality. So what if when you go and do your scientific study about what we mean when we use moral terms, so what I mean when I use the term praiseworthy, for instance, or blameworthy, that I do, by definition, mean something religious.
Yeah.
There might be different religious things throughout the world, but perhaps it's the case that if you do the semantic study, the end result will be that religion is the correct answer based on our terms, is the common agreement of terms, rather than science. And I would think that that would actually be more likely